Judge Grayson believed he was dealing with a naive teen, but then the defendant began to unravel the case with the precision of an experienced lawyer. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt heavy, almost stifling. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, whispering anxiously among themselves as they observed the scene unfold. The defendant's table loomed large over the young man standing beside it. Hands clenched in his pockets, chin raised slightly as if to mask the unease within. Jaylen Dawson, 19. He was charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, yet the intensity of Judge Grayson's gaze left no room for doubt. The true challenge was entirely unrelated to the legal system. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping anxiously against the polished wood of his desk. He glanced down at Jaylen over the edge of his glasses, his lips contorting into a mix of a smirk and a sneer. "Do you really believe you're an authority on legal matters?" His voice held a sharp edge of amusement. "This isn't some kind of debate club, kid." A few uneasy chuckles echoed in the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, and the prosecutor all stood there, their presence heavy in the air. Everyone was part of the joke. Jaylen remained completely still. Himself. He didn't find it funny. He had devoted countless years to getting ready for this moment, not this particular one. He never imagined he would find himself in this position, yet he was all too familiar with the courtroom's every detail. He consumed case law while other kids focused on basketball stats. As his friends immersed themselves in video games, he found himself lost in a whirlwind of mock trials, fervently debating imaginary cases within the confines of his mind. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and Jaylen had grown up hearing the stories she brought home, each one filled with tension and uncertainty. Jaylen grew up hearing stories about how prosecutors rushed through cases, how judges showed bias, and how some defense attorneys hardly put in any effort. He took in every detail, his mind racing with thoughts. By the time he was 14, he could dissect a trial with a precision that surpassed many law students. But none of that seemed to register with Grayson. To him, Jaylen was merely another kid caught in a difficult situation. "Let's get this over with," the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience let out another nervous chuckle. But this time, everything felt different. Jaylen's lips twisted into a subtle, barely noticeable smirk, because Grayson had just made his very first mistake. But the courtroom remained oblivious for the moment. The prosecutor, Ethan Caldwell, stood up from his seat, exuding an unsettling confidence as if victory was already in his grasp. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried that rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. Yet there was an underlying tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to demonstrate unequivocally that the defendant, Jaylen Dawson, was apprehended in a stolen vehicle with clear evidence against him. Just hours before his arrest, someone reported a 2022 Audi A6 missing. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he reportedly attempted to flee before securing his arrest. We found his fingerprints on the steering wheel. The prosecution asserts that the evidence is clear and undeniable." The words struck heavily. The crowd in the gallery shifted, their hushed voices creating an uneasy atmosphere. At first glance, it seemed utterly incriminating. A car that has been stolen. The race was a frantic pursuit, racing. Judge Grayson shot a quick look at Jaylen above the rim of his glasses, then redirected his attention to Ethan Caldwell. "Proceed." The prosecutor approached the jury box, the sound of his polished shoes echoing sharply against the floor. "The defense might attempt to persuade you that this was merely a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is an unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Jaylen for the very first time. But let's face it, what type of victim flees from the police? The atmosphere in the room became increasingly charged. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his chin resting on his hand, an air of anticipation surrounding him. Jaylen stared, unblinking. Ethan Caldwell pressed on, anxiously flipping through a stack of papers. Your Honor, I present the testimony of Officer Michael O'Connell, who directly observed the defendant at the wheel just before he tried to escape. The car has been confirmed as stolen. The arrest was executed precisely as outlined. Grayson let out a sharp breath through his nose, nodding slightly. Seems pretty simple, I guess. And for the majority of individuals present, it likely did. The case was straightforward. A car that has been stolen, a pursuit. A sudden arrest occurred. But Jaylen had spent countless years studying trials, and it was impossible not to notice the cracks. He remained quiet, tension hanging in the air. Observing, anticipating, Judge Grayson tapped his gavel with a slight hesitation. Okay, I'm anxious to hear what the defense has to say. He glanced at Jaylen's lawyer, a public defender named Sarah Jenkins, who had hardly uttered a word since entering the courtroom. She stood up, fidgeting anxiously. Your Honor, my client. Jaylen placed a hand on her arm, a quiet plea. She paused, then reluctantly sat back down, and for the first time, Jaylen finally spoke. I will be representing myself, Your Honor. The room fell into an eerie silence. Grayson fixed his gaze on him, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. What will you do? Jaylen's voice was tight, wavering. I will be defending myself. A low whisper rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up, a sudden tension filling the air. Ethan Caldwell's smirk wavered for a brief moment before he released a sudden, sharp laugh. This feels like it could be quite intense. However, there was an uneasy silence as Jaylen took his first step forward, signaling that everything was about to change. The atmosphere in the courtroom pressed down on Jaylen as he shifted his stance, his hands remaining tucked in his pockets. He allowed the silence to linger just long enough to create a sense of unease. Then, at last, he spoke. Your Honor, before I start, I need to clarify something with the prosecution. Ethan Caldwell raised an eyebrow, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. Proceed. Jaylen hesitated, inching forward cautiously. You mentioned, Officer Michael O'Connell, that you personally observed me behind the wheel before my arrest, right? Ethan Caldwell let out a quick breath, his impatience palpable. Exactly. Is that testimony included in his report? Absolutely it is. Jaylen nodded, then quickly turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I request that we dismiss that testimony as evidence. Grayson narrowed his eyes at him. What are the reasons for that? Jaylen yanked his hands from his pockets, his movements sharp as he pointed toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer O'Connell never laid eyes on me in that car. Actually, he wasn't even on duty when the chase started. A flash of uncertainty darted across Ethan Caldwell's face. What are you saying? Jaylen hesitated for a moment before taking another step forward. Your Honor, if the court permits, I would like to urgently submit a request to verify Officer O'Connell's GPS logs from that night. If his report indicates that he saw me in the vehicle, then it must align with his location history. However, he allowed the word to linger, heavy and unspoken. I just can't shake the feeling that it won't. Now the whispers in the gallery intensified. Grayson furrowed his brow, casting a quick, anxious look at Ethan Caldwell. Is there a counselor available? Ethan Caldwell cleared his throat, his jaw clenched tightly. That report was submitted by a law enforcement officer, Your Honor. Are we seriously going to trust a defendant's word instead of that of a trained professional? Jaylen offered a slight, seemingly indifferent shrug. If the officer was indeed where he said he was, then the GPS data should confirm it, but if he wasn't... He allowed the sentence to fade into silence. Grayson scrutinized him for what felt like an eternity, then shifted his gaze to Ethan Caldwell. Is there any problem for the prosecution in confirming the officer's GPS logs? Ethan Caldwell paused, uncertainty gripping him. The pause stretched on, feeling like an eternity. The jury was aware. the gallery observed. Most importantly, the judge was aware of the situation. Jaylen inhaled softly, his heart racing. He had spent years observing trials, analyzing prosecutors, their strategies, and the way they manipulated the system. Regardless of the circumstances, he remained certain about one thing. If Ethan Caldwell truly believed in his case, he wouldn't be hesitating. Grayson let out a heavy breath, his fingers pressing against his temple. "Is there a counselor available?" Ethan Caldwell finally shook his head, a tightness in his chest growing stronger. "There are no objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already started. For the first time, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The courtroom was silent, yet the atmosphere was thick with unease. Ethan Caldwell shuffled his papers, his once polished confidence starting to fray. "Your Honor, as we await the GPS records, it is crucial to note that the defendant's fingerprints were discovered on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jaylen gave a slight nod, his expression difficult to decipher. "That's definitely true." He hesitated for a moment before taking a step forward. "But let's discuss that evidence for a moment." Grayson raised an eyebrow, his expression tight as he gestured for him to continue. Jaylen turned to the jury, his gaze darting from one member to another, searching for any sign of understanding. "The prosecution is trying to convince you that my fingerprints being found in a car implies that I stole it. That's the narrative they're pushing, but let's consider this carefully." He took a deep breath, his tone wavering slightly, barely masking the unease within. Imagine stepping into a department store, your heart racing as you approach the rack and pick up a jacket to try on. You shove your hands into the pockets, perhaps zip it up, then hastily return it to the rack and exit. A few hours later, that jacket is stolen from the store. Does having your fingerprints on it imply that you took it? A few jurors shot quick, anxious glances at one another. Someone in the gallery whispered something quietly, their voice barely audible. Jaylen rushed in, not allowing them a moment to catch their breath. Before the alleged theft, the car in question sat outside a 7-Eleven for hours. I found myself in that store with 3 friends, and yes, as we walked past the car, I found myself leaning against it, feeling a rush of uncertainty. I actually opened the door, since it was already unlocked. I really didn't give it much thought. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't take anything from inside. There was a moment of curiosity that felt a bit overwhelming. He paused for a moment, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Then, in a voice that sliced through the silence with precision, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Ethan Caldwell cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, desperately searching for something, anything, to regain control. Jaylen was far from done. "And while we're on the topic, let's discuss how that fingerprint analysis was conducted." He quickly turned to Grayson. "Your Honor, could you verify whether the forensic specialist involved in this case received a subpoena to testify?" Grayson blinked, taken aback by the sudden question. He shot a quick look at Ethan Caldwell. The prosecutor paused, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Them, with considerable hesitation. "No." Jaylen's lips were tightly pressed together. "Okay, so I need to clarify this. The state is relying on forensic evidence to attempt to convict me, yet they deemed it unnecessary to bring in the actual specialist who handled that evidence. Is there really no opportunity for me to cross-examine, inquire about the chain of custody, or contest the accuracy of the analysis?" Ethan Caldwell's jaw clenched. Jaylen nodded, as if that was the only reassurance he required. "That's intriguing." Judge Grayson sharply exhaled while tightly gripping the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man coming to terms with the unsettling truth that this case was far from the straightforward victory he had anticipated. But Jaylen still had more to say. Jaylen's next statement had the potential to change everything. Jaylen took a cautious step forward, his voice unwavering yet intense. "Your Honor, I would like to submit an official statement from the vehicle's owner as evidence." Judge Grayson scowled. "The owner?" Jaylen nodded, his heart racing. "Absolutely. Mr. Howard Miller, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, gave a statement to the police that for reasons unknown was never included in the prosecution's filings. And I believe I have an idea of the reason. He quickly turned to Ethan Caldwell. Remember what Mr. Howard Miller told the officers when they reported his car stolen that night? Ethan Caldwell's jaw tightened. He was acutely aware of what lay ahead. Jaylen rushed ahead without waiting for him to respond. Instead, he anxiously pulled out a printed transcript from his file and began to read aloud. I left my car running when I hurried inside the gas station. It seems like some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the person you took into custody. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp echoed in the courtroom. Jaylen gripped the paper tightly. That's from the original police report. It was this very report that the prosecution conveniently chose to ignore. He anxiously turned back to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer left this out of his testimony. The prosecution overlooked it. And yet they expect this jury to accept that I, a person who doesn't even fit the description of the actual thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Ethan Caldwell stepped forward, his movements frantic. Your Honor, this matter does not pertain to the case at hand. We found the defendant in possession of the vehicle. But Jaylen quickly shook his head. No, I was not. His voice remained steady, yet it sliced through the courtroom with a piercing clarity. I found myself arrested just a few blocks from where the vehicle was left behind, making my way home after grabbing snacks with my friends. I was not in the car. I was nowhere close to the car. I wasn't escaping from anything. The only thing connecting me to this case is poor police work and hasty conclusions. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing against his temple. The case was coming apart quickly, and it was clear to everyone. Jaylen turned back to the jury, his heart racing as he faced their scrutinizing gazes. The actual suspect escaped that night. The officers discovered a black kid in the vicinity and concluded that was sufficient. This is the core of what this case truly entails: stillness. Grayson swallowed hard and fidgeted with his glasses. Is there anything else the prosecution would like to add? Ethan Caldwell was rigid, his face burning with heat. No, Your Honor. Judge Grayson let out a breath. He stared at Jaylen for what felt like an eternity, then quickly shifted his gaze to the jury. At last, he leaned forward, his voice barely steady, and uttered the words that would linger in the minds of everyone present. The court has dismissed the case. A moment of shocked stillness was followed by an eruption of disorder. Half the courtroom erupted, a mix of disbelief and quiet relief hanging in the air. The gallery buzzed with anticipation, reporters hurriedly jotting down notes. Jaylen hesitated, remaining still for a moment. He allowed the moment to linger, letting the reality weigh heavily on everyone. Judge Grayson, his gavel firmly in hand, stared at Jaylen with an expression that revealed nothing. There was an unsettling intensity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. There might even be a hint of remorse. Jaylen met his gaze, then quickly turned to leave. But just as he approached the door, the judge's voice cut through the air once more. Mr. Dawson. Jaylen halted, yet remained facing away. Grayson paused, his voice shaky as he finally suggested, You should consider law school. Jaylen's lips curled into a smirk. He felt no need to think it over. He was already on his way, and the anticipation was almost overwhelming. Outside the courthouse, the air was heavy with murmurs and whispers. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing rapidly, microphones jabbing forward like they were ready for a fight. Jaylen, were you aware that the judge might dismiss the case? What will you do next? What is it like to outsmart a veteran prosecutor? Jaylen yanked his hoodie over his head, avoiding the questions that buzzed around him. He seemed completely indifferent to the spectacle. This wasn't about demonstrating his intelligence. It felt like it was about something much larger. His mother, Denise, stood anxiously at the bottom of the steps, her eyes fixed on the door. Her arms were tightly crossed, her face a mask of uncertainty. For what felt like an eternity, she simply stared at him. Then finally she shook her head and released a shaky breath. "You really startled me." Jaylen let out a nervous laugh, his hand nervously scratching the back of his head. "I had to take a risk, Ma." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then wrapped her arms around him in a firm embrace. "You have always been the one who refuses to back down." The cameras kept flashing, but Jaylen had lost interest in them entirely. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Grayson observed intently. His posture felt unsettlingly different now. The arrogance had vanished. His expression had shifted, no longer holding any trace of amusement. It was something entirely different, something that felt more like introspection. He never expected this case to be anything special or extraordinary. It was simply another day, a different defendant, and yet another guilty plea. My heart races as I think about what comes next. But now, he was certain this one would stick with him. Jaylen had accomplished something that few could ever hope to achieve. He forced the system to examine its own workings, and for once, it was the first to blink. Here's the lesson we need to grasp. How many other cases had unfolded like this? How many individuals faced conviction? The convictions were not due to evidence, but rather to bias, shortcuts, and a system that prioritized closing cases over uncovering the truth. Jaylen possessed the knowledge to defend himself. But what about those who didn't? This was more than just a single case. It was concerning each and every one of them. He was acutely aware of what he had to do next. This courtroom certainly wouldn't be the final one he faced, but next time he would not find himself in the defendant's seat. He would be the attorney. And when that day arrived, he certainly wouldn't be alone. If this story crossed your mind even for just a moment, then please share it. The justice system relies on laws. Individuals, however, are in charge, and people can change, but we have to make them happen. Press the like button, subscribe for more meaningful stories, and let's continue the conversation. Please don't hesitate. Next time it could be someone else entirely. It could possibly be someone familiar to you.